Good evening. Let us look more carefully at what is happening here tonight, because if you have been watching the headlines and thinking you understand what just struck the Islamic Republic of Iran, you are only seeing the surface of a story that runs far deeper than any anchor will tell you. Most people watching tonight are asking one question: how hard did America hit? But that is the wrong question. The right question, the one that actually unlocks what is unfolding, is this: why did Tehran not see it coming? Because they thought they had a map. They thought they understood the pressure architecture. They thought the Biden-era diplomatic instinct, the return to the table posture, the careful avoidance of escalation was the permanent condition of American foreign policy. They were wrong. And the nature of that mistake, structural, historical, psychological, is what we are going to examine tonight, layer by layer. Stay with me through this, because if you think the story is simply about sanctions or military strikes, you have already missed the architecture underneath. And if you want to keep seeing that architecture clearly, this channel will continue to be the place to do it. So subscribe now before we go further. Let us first establish what everyone is reporting, and then let us explain why that reporting is incomplete. On the surface, what we are witnessing is a dramatic escalation in American economic and strategic pressure on the Islamic Republic. Beginning in early 2025, the Trump administration reinstated and dramatically expanded what Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent publicly called a policy of maximum pressure 2.0, a deliberate, coordinated campaign targeting Iranian oil revenues, its petrochemical export networks, its financial intermediaries across the Gulf, and the network of front companies it has spent 20 years constructing in Iraq, the UAE, Malaysia, and China. And by March of 2026, the United States Treasury had sanctioned more than 400 entities in a single 18-month window. Oil revenues, which had partially recovered to approximately $90 billion annually during the diplomatic opening of the early 2020s, have been compressed back toward $40 to $50 billion, a figure that, when set against Iran's internal budget requirements, creates what economists at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies described as a structural deficit approaching $25 billion per year. Simultaneously, the United States has repositioned carrier strike groups in the Arabian Sea, conducted direct consultations with Saudi Arabia and the UAE on regional containment architecture, and applied secondary sanctions pressure on Chinese refineries absorbing discounted Iranian crude at a volume that had reached approximately 1.5 million barrels per day as recently as late 2024. Now, the mainstream coverage will tell you this is a story of American power reasserting itself. And they are not entirely wrong, but they are missing something that changes everything about how we read what comes next. To understand why the Ayatollahs genuinely did not expect this blow with this timing and this coordination, you have to understand the strategic assumption that governed Tehran's calculus for the past several years. The Islamic Republic, since at least 2019, has been operating on a framework its leadership privately refers to as strategic patience. The logic was simple. American domestic politics were too divided, American attention too fractured, American strategic will too depleted by 20 years of Middle Eastern misadventure for Washington to sustain a coherent, coordinated, genuinely costly pressure campaign. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, now in his mid-80s, and the Revolutionary Guard's senior commanders around him had watched the Obama administration negotiate the Trump first-term maximum pressure campaign crack, but not break them. The Biden administration reversed course and returned to diplomatic channels. What they drew from that sequence was a conclusion. American pressure is episodic. It comes in waves, but it is never architecturally sustained. If you outlast it, a new administration changes the rules. That assumption, which seemed rational in 2021 and 2022, contained a catastrophic miscalculation, one that only becomes visible when you zoom out to the structural level. The miscalculation was this: Tehran assumed the next American pressure campaign would look like the last one. It would be primarily economic, relatively isolated diplomatically, and softened by the persistent American desire to avoid a war that a war-exhausted public would not support. What they did not adequately model was the degree to which the regional architecture had fundamentally shifted around them. Here is where the layered analysis becomes essential. And this is the part that changes how you see every piece of news coming out of the region. The first layer is the Abraham Accords transformation, which the mainstream coverage has consistently underestimated in its strategic consequence. Between 2020 and 2026, the normalization framework has not simply created diplomatic relationships between Israel and a handful of Gulf states. It has created an interoperable intelligence and security architecture that did not exist before. Saudi Arabia, while not formally normalized, has engaged in extensive defense consultations with Israel since 2023. The UAE operates what Israeli defense analysts describe as a shared threat assessment framework covering Iranian drone and missile programs. Bahrain hosts American naval assets with a level of host nation cooperation that has expanded materially since 2020. What this means in practice is that American pressure on Iran now operates through a regional coalition that can provide overflight access, intelligence sharing, financial intelligence on Iranian front companies, and, critically, political cover for sustained pressure without the American domestic political cost of going it alone. The second layer is the Chinese dimension. Beijing's relationship with Tehran has been the primary shock absorber that kept the Iranian economy from complete collapse under maximum pressure 1.0. The 25-year cooperation agreement signed in 2021 was supposed to provide Iran with investment, technology, and a guaranteed market for its oil that bypassed American financial infrastructure. What actually happened is more complicated and more damaging to Iranian interests. Chinese state refineries absorbed Iranian crude at discounts of between $15 and $25 per barrel below market price, meaning Tehran was already subsidizing Beijing's energy security while receiving diminished revenue. And when secondary sanctions targeting Chinese entities began landing in early 2025, Beijing's response was not to escalate its defense of Iranian oil channels. Beijing quietly reduced its exposure. Several major Chinese refineries, including Shandong-based independent refiners who had been absorbing the bulk of the sanctioned crude, reduced purchases by an estimated 20 to 30% in the fourth quarter of 2025. Tehran had assumed Beijing was a strategic partner. What Beijing has demonstrated is that it is a transactional partner, and when the transactional cost rises, Beijing steps back. The third layer is the internal Iranian economic condition, which the Ayatollahs cannot publicly acknowledge because acknowledgement would accelerate the political consequence. The Iranian rial, as of early 2026, has lost approximately 90% of its value against the dollar compared to 2018. Inflation, by independent economic estimates, has been running between 40 and 60% annually for multiple consecutive years. Youth unemployment officially stands above 25%, but is widely understood to exceed 40% in urban centers. The protest movement that erupted following the death of Mahsa Amini in September 2022 did not disappear. It went underground, and its organizational memory persists in a generation of Iranians who have entirely lost faith in the system's capacity for self-correction. The Supreme Leader's Office is managing not merely external pressure, but a legitimacy crisis that compounds every time a new sanctions wave hits household purchasing power. The fourth layer is the axis of resistance degradation. Iran's strategic depth, the external force multiplier it spent decades constructing through Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, and Shia militias in Iraq, has been materially degraded since October 2023 in ways that do not yet fully appear in the geopolitical pricing. Hezbollah, which represented the crown jewel of the Iranian deterrence architecture, has suffered leadership losses, battlefield attrition in southern Lebanon, and a political environment in Beirut that is newly hostile to its armed state within a state model. Hamas's military infrastructure in Gaza has been substantially destroyed. The Houthis continue to operate in the Red Sea corridor, but are absorbing sustained American and British strikes that are degrading their precision munitions capacity. Iran's ability to threaten escalation through proxies, the central mechanism of its deterrence, is weaker in early 2026 than at any point in the past 15 years. The fifth layer is the nuclear dimension, which is the most consequential and the least discussed in mainstream coverage. Iran's nuclear program has advanced to the point where international inspectors from the IAEA formally reported in late 2024 that the Islamic Republic possesses sufficient enriched uranium at 90% enrichment levels to theoretically produce multiple nuclear devices if the decision to weaponize were made. The question of whether and when Iran crosses that threshold is no longer theoretical. It is operational. And the current American pressure campaign exists in its deepest strategic logic, not merely to constrain Iranian regional behavior, but to force a fundamental decision: return to a negotiated limitation or face the prospect of military action against nuclear facilities that Israel and the United States are both clearly signaling they are willing to conduct. Now let us examine the historical pattern, because this moment has occurred before, and what happened before tells us something precise about what is most likely to happen next. The clearest historical parallel is not, as many analysts suggest, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The cleaner parallel is the period between 1979 and 1981, when the Islamic Republic's foundational overconfidence about American political will led directly to a strategic miscalculation that shaped the following 4 decades. Ayatollah Khomeini believed, after the hostage crisis, that American domestic division and humiliation would prevent any decisive response. He was correct in the short term and catastrophically wrong in the long term, because the humiliation he inflicted on America generated a strategic hostility that has never fully dissipated. The second historical parallel is Iraq under Saddam Hussein between 1990 and 1991. Saddam's invasion of Kuwait was premised on the assessment that the United States would not sustain a coalition capable of reversing it. He miscalculated not the American military capability, he knew it was superior, but the American political will and the coalition architecture the United States could assemble around a clear strategic interest. The coalition that materialized was larger, more coordinated, and more regionally legitimate than his analysis had modeled. A third parallel, closer to the present, is the North Korean experience post-2017. When the Trump administration applied maximum pressure combined with explicit military threat language against Pyongyang, Kim Jong-un did not capitulate, but he did agree to a diplomatic process that his regime had previously refused. The leverage was not that America broke North Korea economically. It was that the combination of economic pressure and military credibility forced a calculation that the cost of continued confrontation exceeded the cost of engagement. Tehran is being walked toward a structurally identical decision point, and the Ayatollahs know it, which is precisely why they are simultaneously signaling openness to indirect dialogue while accelerating their nuclear posture as a deterrent against the military option. Between 2019 and 2026, the sequence of significant developments reads as a chronicle of strategic erosion, maximum pressure 1.0 beginning May 2018, the Iranian nuclear deal's effective collapse by 2019, the killing of IRGC Commander Qasem Soleimani in January 2020, the Abraham Accords normalization wave across 2020 and 2021, Iran's nuclear enrichment acceleration through 2022 and 2023, the October 7th, 2023 Hamas attack, and the subsequent degradation of the axis of resistance through 2024 and 2025, the return of maximum pressure 2.0 in 2025, the Chinese partial withdrawal from Iranian oil absorption, the tightened regional coalition architecture, and the current moment where Tehran faces simultaneous economic compression, proxy degradation, nuclear threshold pressure, and internal legitimacy crisis in a configuration it has never previously encountered all at once. Let us now examine what this actually means going forward, because this is where the analysis becomes genuinely consequential. There are 3 distinct scenarios that the current pressure architecture makes possible, and understanding the difference between them is what separates strategic clarity from wishful thinking. The first scenario is coerced negotiation. In this scenario, the economic pressure and proxy degradation reach a threshold where the Ayatollah's inner circle concludes that a return to some form of negotiated nuclear limitation in exchange for meaningful sanctions relief is the least costly path available. This is the scenario the current American pressure campaign is architected to produce. Its probability depends on one critical variable: whether the Iranian leadership calculates that negotiation is survivable domestically. The problem is that Khamenei has spent years making the argument that engagement with America leads to humiliation, not relief. Accepting an American-dictated framework now would require him to acknowledge that his strategic patience framework has failed, a concession that may be existentially dangerous for a leadership whose legitimacy is already under internal pressure. The second scenario is escalatory defiance. In this scenario, Iran concludes that the pressure campaign is designed not to negotiate, but to achieve regime change or nuclear rollback through collapse, and that any negotiated settlement would only be a prelude to further demands. In this calculation, accelerating toward a nuclear threshold becomes the primary deterrent. If Iran can cross into de facto nuclear status before the military option is exercised, it fundamentally changes the cost-benefit calculus for American and Israeli military planners. This scenario carries the highest systemic risk because it forces a binary choice onto Washington and Jerusalem: accept a nuclear Iran or conduct military action whose regional consequences, Strait of Hormuz closure, oil price shock, proxy retaliation across multiple theaters, would be severe. The third scenario, and the one that receives the least analytical attention, is managed internal fracture. In this scenario, the pressure does not produce foreign policy change. It produces domestic political change inside Iran itself. The economic devastation reaches a point where segments of the Revolutionary Guard's own base, the merchant class, the Bazari networks, whose loyalty has historically underwritten clerical rule, begin to calculate that the survival of the system requires its transformation. This is not revolution in the dramatic sense. It is the quieter, slower, more structurally significant process of the system being forced to choose between change and collapse, and beginning to choose change without publicly acknowledging that the pressure is what forced the choice. Now let us pull the lens all the way back, because what we are watching in Iran is not simply a bilateral story about America and the Islamic Republic. It is a stress test of a broader question that will define the next 20 years of international order. The question is this: can a medium power state use nuclear ambiguity, regional proxies, and the cover of a multipolar world order to permanently insulate itself from the consequences of its geopolitical choices? Iran's strategic framework for the past 4 decades has been premised on the answer being yes. What the current moment is revealing is that the answer is far less certain than Tehran had assumed. And the reason it is less certain is that the structural pillars of Iranian deterrence, from the axis of resistance to the Chinese oil absorption to the American political divisions that made sustained pressure impossible, have all shifted simultaneously in an unfavorable direction. History has seen this precise configuration before. The moment when a revisionist power that has been managing multiple pressure vectors discovers that the vectors have converged into a single coherent force, and that the window for strategic maneuver has narrowed faster than its internal planning models predicted. What happens in those moments is rarely what either side intends. The danger is not the pressure itself. The danger is the gap between the pressure and the off-ramp, and whether the leadership under pressure has the institutional capacity to walk through an off-ramp without triggering the internal collapse it was trying to prevent. That is the civilizational warning embedded in this moment. Not that America has struck Iran hard. America has struck Iran hard before in various forms, and the Islamic Republic has survived. The warning is that the architecture of that survival, the external alliances, the proxy networks, the economic workarounds, the nuclear deterrence by ambiguity, has been systematically degraded to a point where the next crisis may not offer the same options. If what you heard tonight challenged your assumptions, deepened your understanding, or helped you see the hidden structure behind what the headlines are calling America's revenge, then this is the channel for you. Subscribe now and do not miss what comes next, because this story is not finished. And before you go, I want to ask you one question. Leave your answer in the comments below and let us see where this community stands. In your assessment, which of the 3 scenarios is Iran most likely to choose? Coerced negotiation, escalatory defiance, or managed internal fracture? Your answer matters, because the next video in this series will examine exactly what a nuclear threshold Iran would mean for the global oil market, for the security architecture of every state between Cairo and Karachi, and for the one regional actor that this entire pressure campaign ultimately cannot afford to ignore. That video is coming. Do not miss it.